A team of researchers digging in the high desert of southern Oregon stumbled onto something that had no business existing according to American history textbooks. On early trips into the field, they uncovered a layer of volcanic ash nearly 16,000 years old, and just beneath it, fragments of camel teeth. The samples were tested once, then again on separate equipment, then a third time to be certain. Every result matched. Whoever had once sheltered here had been living on this continent thousands of years earlier than mainstream science claimed any human being had set foot here. What researchers pulled from that Oregon hillside exposed a story that had been repeated as fact for over a century, and it was wrong from the start. Tucked into a cliff face in south-central Oregon sits a cluster of shallow rock shelters known as the Paisley Caves. Nothing marks them as important. Yet buried inside was evidence the archaeological establishment had overlooked for nearly a century. The first serious dig took place in the 1930s, led by archaeologist Luther Cressman, who uncovered clear traces of ancient human presence and published his findings. His peers decided the work clashed with the story they'd already settled on and set it aside. For decades the site sat forgotten while the field clung to a single explanation for how humans reached the Americas, a crossing from Siberia into Alaska roughly 13,000 years ago over a strip of land exposed by falling Ice Age sea levels. That version became gospel, printed in classrooms and mounted on museum walls, and nobody was eager to reopen a dusty cave that might undo it. Eventually, a University of Oregon team returned to excavate properly. What they found wasn't a spear point. It was fossilized human waste, sitting undisturbed for thousands of years, preserved by the arid desert climate after nearly every other organic trace in the shelters had decomposed. Around it were animal remains and woven cordage, signs of an actual dwelling, not a brief stopover. The samples sat in storage until genetic tools advanced enough to analyze material that old. When that finally happened, geneticists got a clear answer. The DNA matched maternal lineages known as haplogroups A2 and B2, genetic threads running directly through Native American communities living today, including the Ojibwe. These weren't the remains of a failed expedition. Their descendants are still here, using accelerator mass spectrometry, which measures the age of the material itself rather than the surrounding soil. Researchers determined the site was over 14,000 years old, at least 1,000 years before the Clovis culture, long celebrated as the continent's first inhabitants. When lead researcher Dennis Jenkins published these findings, the backlash targeted his credibility, not his methodology. To understand why, you need to understand exactly what this discovery was tearing down. For most of the 20th century, a single explanation dominated every conversation about the earliest Americans: the Clovis first model. It was tidy, easy to teach, and reproduced in textbook after textbook. And Oregon's discovery dismantled it. The Clovis culture takes its name from Clovis, New Mexico, where distinctive fluted spear points were first unearthed in the 1930s. Traces of these tools turned up across the continent, and the theory built around them rested on genuine physical evidence. According to the model, hunters crossed Beringia about 13,000 years ago, pushed south through a gap in the retreating ice, and spread across a continent with no prior human presence. Entire academic careers and museum exhibits were built around this narrative, and challenging the date meant telling the people who built those exhibits that their life's work rested on a false premise. There was a problem the field preferred not to discuss, though those iconic Clovis points have never once turned up anywhere in Asia. The ancestors of the Clovis people did originate in Asia, but they didn't carry this tool style with them. It was developed here, on American soil. The stakes reached well past academic pride. 2. For decades, the Clovis first timeline factored into legal disputes over Native American land and burial rights, since a shorter human history in the Americas meant weaker legal footing for indigenous ancestral claims. By the 1990s, as the evidence against Clovis first became too obvious to dismiss, major institutions quietly revised their exhibit placards with no public acknowledgement of the earlier error. Oregon's 14,000-year-old date didn't just suggest a correction. It proved the entire model was broken. And about 70 miles away, another site had been waiting in the ground, ready to make denial even harder. That site is Rimrock Drawer Rock Shelter, near the small town of Riley, Oregon. Beginning in 2011, archaeologist Patrick O'Grady led excavations there, and what surfaced reshaped the timeline again. Progress was slow, until a team found a thin band of white volcanic ash, later matched to a known eruption of Mount St. Helens roughly 15,000 years ago. That ash layer created a fixed timestamp. Anything above it was younger, anything below it older. Beneath that layer, researchers recovered 27 fragments of animal teeth, including remains from extinct Ice Age camel larger than any camel alive today, and from an ancient bison relative around a quarter heavier than modern bison, with horns spanning up to 7 feet. People here were hunting massive game without metal weapons or domesticated animals, and human hunting pressure likely contributed to the eventual extinction of both species. Then came the more remarkable find, a stone tool buried 10 centimeters deeper than the animal teeth, meaning it predated them. Fashioned from a glass-like stone called orange chalcedony, it had 3 working edges, one for cutting, one for scraping, one serrated for sawing, and the serrated edge had been worn perfectly smooth through years of continuous use, evidence of one person relying on it daily for most of a lifetime. The surrounding teeth dated to between 21,000 and 20,000 years old, meaning the deeper tool had to be older still, a result O'Grady confirmed twice on separate samples. The tool belonged to the Western stem tradition, a tool-making style entirely distinct from Clovis and predating it by thousands of years, evidence of separate population already established in Oregon long before Clovis arrived. But Oregon wasn't the first place this truth had surfaced. Decades earlier, one researcher on the opposite coast reached the same conclusion and spent 40 years being attacked for it. In western Pennsylvania, near the Ohio River, sits a sandstone shelter called Meadowcroft. In 1955, local historian Albert Miller pulled stone artifacts from a groundhog burrow on his property and spent the next 18 years trying to convince archaeologists to investigate, with little success. Nobody arrived until 1973, when James Adavaggio began an excavation that eventually revealed 52 distinct occupation layers, among the richest stratified records anywhere in the Americas. Nobody disputed what physically existed at the site. The argument was over its age. Testing placed human presence there between 16,000 and 19,000 years ago, well before Clovis. When Adavaggio published in 1980, criticism arrived swiftly, led by geologist Vance Haynes, who argued the samples had been contaminated by ancient carbon from nearby coal deposits. Adavaggio refuted the claim point by point in a published rebuttal, yet Haynes's reputation kept the accusation alive for years after it had already been answered. Funding dried up, and colleagues quietly distanced themselves. The resistance became so pronounced that researchers coined a term for it, Clovis primacy syndrome, the reflexive rejection of any evidence for pre-Clovis humans regardless of its strength. Even now, only a minority of archaeologists fully accept Adavaggio's dates, not because the evidence is weak, but because accepting it means admitting generations of respected scholars built careers defending a mistake. Farther south, another site held something even more striking, not tools, not DNA, but footprints. 61 of them, some small enough to belong to a child. That site is White Sands National Park in southern New Mexico, an expanse of pale gypsum dunes that once sat beneath a large Ice Age lake. In 2009, researchers crossing the dried lake bed found human footprints, 61 in total, preserved down to individual toe impressions. Some belonged to a small child, others to adults moving quickly, a frozen moment of people walking along the lake's edge before their tracks hardened in the sun and were sealed beneath sediment for millennia. Alongside them ran tracks from Columbian mammoths and giant ground sloths, animals weighing up to nearly 400 pounds with claws capable of tearing through predators. In one section, a child's footprints overlap with sloth tracks in a pattern researchers interpret as deliberate tracking, possibly the earliest direct evidence of hunting behavior anywhere in the Americas. 3 independent teams dated the site using different materials in the same layer, seeds, conifer pollen, and lakebed organic matter, and all 3 converge on the same range, 21 to 23,000 years old, placing people here at the height of the last Ice Age, a period the traditional narrative insisted was empty of humans. When these results were published in 2021, the paper faced unusually aggressive anonymous peer review, with several reviewers attempting to block it outright. But a site in Southern California pushes the numbers so much further back that everything before it starts to look recent, and it wasn't uncovered by scientists at all. It was struck by a road crews bulldozer. In the early 1990s, freeway construction crews near San Diego hit something solid buried in the soil. Paleontologists were called in, and the team uncovered the remains of mastodon, an extinct elephant relative. The bones showed spiral fractures, a pattern that only occurs when bone breaks while still fresh and moist, unlike the brittle fractures of long fossilized bone, meaning someone had broken these bones shortly after the animal died. Nearby were 5 heavy stones that geological testing confirmed could not have been carried there by water, meaning people brought them intentionally and used them as hammers and anvils to crack the bones open for marrow. The bones were excavated in 1992 and 1993, then sat in storage for nearly 25 years. In 2017, dating results published in the journal Nature, using uranium-thorium dating, returned the same figure every time, roughly 130,700 years old, older than the period when modern humans are believed to have first spread out of Africa. Skeptics argue the fractures could be explained by geological pressure, but structural geologists tested and rejected that explanation. So, who left this evidence behind? Not modern humans and not Neanderthals. The most plausible candidate is a Denisovan, a little understood branch of the human family tree. And Denisovan DNA has already been detected in the genomes of modern indigenous peoples of the Americas. Most of the field avoids engaging with this site, not because it's been disproven, but because the implications are too disruptive to too many established careers. Taken together, these sites tell a story far more complicated than a single frozen land bridge crossing. Oregon broke the timeline. Pennsylvania confirmed it decades earlier. New Mexico placed entire families on the landscape during the last ice age. California pushed the date into territory the field still isn't prepared to accept. That raises an unavoidable question. If people arrived by such varied paths across such a vast span of time, was a single land route ever really the whole story? For 100 years, the standard explanation held that the first Americans simply walked across Beringia and pushed south through a gap in the retreating glaciers. One route, one door, case closed. Then the island of Cyprus complicated everything. Cyprus has been surrounded by open ocean for roughly 5 million years, with no land connection ever existing. Yet researchers found stone tools that are dating between 130,000 and 700,000 years old, crafted by archaic human relatives like Homo heidelbergensis and Homo erectus, long before modern humans existed. Reaching that island required deliberate seafaring, which erased the core assumption behind the Beringia-only model, that ancient humans lacked the capability to cross open water. This opens the door to the kelp highway hypothesis. During the Ice Age, a nearly continuous belt of kelp forest stretched along the Pacific coastline from Japan to California, providing a steady food source for people traveling by small boats along the shore, possibly a more reliable route than a frozen inland corridor. Geneticists tracking a maternal lineage called D4H followed its path from coastal China through Japan and into the Americas, revealing 2 separate migration waves. The earlier wave moved along the Pacific coast by boat roughly 26,000 years ago. A second, later wave crossed overland via Beringia around 15,000 years ago, and this second group became the Clovis-era population long credited as first. They weren't first at all. They arrived after others had already been here for thousands of years. The Ainu people of northern Japan share notable genetic overlap with founding Native American lineages, suggesting Japan may have been close to where this earlier migration truly began. The Rimrock draw tool supports this connection directly. Its Western stem toolmaking style shares traits with ancient East Asian Pacific coastal cultures, suggesting it wasn't invented locally but carried across the ocean by that first wave, used for a lifetime, and eventually left behind in the shelter of a volcano would seal for the next 21,000 years. If people were already present on this continent 21,000 years ago, and possibly more than 100,000 years ago, arriving by routes researchers are only beginning to map, then the real question becomes what else remains buried in ground nobody has thought to dig yet.